her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "She didn't want you to be alone, Michael." The funeral home buzzed with quiet conversation around us, but in that moment, everything faded away except for my wife's final message clutched in my shaking hands. If you're enjoying this story so far, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel for more emotional stories that explore the depths of human connection and healing. Your support helps us continue sharing these meaningful narratives. I couldn't bring myself to open it, not with everyone watching. The weight of Sarah's casket being lowered into the ground just hours earlier was still crushing my chest. How could she possibly have planned for this moment? My Sarah, always thinking ahead, always taking care of everyone else, even as cancer slowly claimed her body over the past 18 months. Our story began 15 years ago at a bookstore cafe where I'd spilled coffee all over her favorite novel. I'd been so embarrassed, but Sarah just laughed, those green eyes crinkling at the corners. "Well," she'd said, "I guess you owe me a new book and dinner." That dinner turned into breakfast the next morning, and before I knew it, we were building a life together. The reception after the funeral was a blur of sympathetic faces and half-eaten casseroles. I nodded mechanically as people shared their memories of Sarah, her kindness as a pediatric nurse, her infamous Christmas cookies, the way she could make anyone feel like the most important person in the room. Each story was another dagger to my heart. How was I supposed to go on without her? Our house felt cavernous when I finally returned home that evening. Sarah's things were everywhere, her reading glasses on the nightstand, her gardening gloves by the back door, her favorite mug still in the dish rack. I collapsed onto our bed, still made with hospital corners the way she liked it, and finally opened the envelope. "My dearest Michael," it began in her familiar looping handwriting. "If you're reading this, then I've already left you, and I'm so sorry for that. But I need you to know something important. I don't want you to be alone." I had to stop reading as sobs racked my body. How could she think about my future when she wouldn't be in it? It felt like a betrayal to even consider it. But Sarah had always been practical, even in the face of her own mortality. "I know you, Michael," her letter continued. "You'll want to shut down, to close yourself off from the world. You'll think it honors my memory somehow. But that would break my heart more than anything. The man I fell in love with was vibrant and curious, and so full of life. Don't let that die with me." The next morning, I called in sick to the architectural firm where I'd worked for the past decade. I couldn't face the pitying looks, the awkward conversations. Instead, I sat in Sarah's garden, reading and rereading her letter. She'd included specific instructions, some practical, some whimsical. "Water my orchids on Thursdays. Join that cooking class you always said you were too busy for. Call your brother more often. And for God's sake, Michael, get rid of those awful flannel pajamas I've been trying to throw away for years." I almost smiled at that last one. Almost. Days turned into weeks. I existed rather than lived, going through the motions of survival. I watered her orchids religiously. I ordered takeout from the same 3 restaurants. I avoided the bedroom closet where her clothes still hung, perfectly organized by color and season. 1 month after the funeral, Claire showed up at my door unannounced, holding a casserole dish and wearing an expression that brooked no argument. "Sarah made me promise to check on you," she said, pushing past me into the house. "And she was right to worry. When was the last time you shaved?" I ran a hand over my patchy beard self-consciously. "I don't know." "What does it matter?" Claire sighed, setting down the food and turning to face me. "It matters because you're still here, Michael. And Sarah wanted more for you than this." She gestured around at the dimly lit living room, the stack of mail I'd been ignoring, the unwashed coffee mug collection on the side table. "Did she leave you instructions too?" I asked bitterly. "Yes," Claire answered simply. "She did." That stopped me short. Of course Sarah would have thought of everything, would have enlisted her practical, no-nonsense sister to make sure I didn't completely fall apart. "What did she tell you to do?" I asked, curiosity temporarily overriding my grief. "She told me to give you time, but not too much." She told me to remind you that loving her doesn't mean stopping your life. And she told me to give you this when I thought you were ready. Claire pulled another envelope from her purse. I stared at it like it might bite. I don't think I'm ready. Sarah thought you would say that, Claire replied with a sad smile. She said to tell you that courage isn't about being ready. It's about doing something even when you're terrified. With trembling fingers, I opened the second letter. Inside was a printed confirmation for a 2-week photography workshop in Arizona, starting the following month. Photography had been a passion of mine before life and career had gotten in the way. Sarah had always encouraged me to pick it up again. She booked this for you last year, Claire explained. She knew exactly when you need it. I shook my head, overwhelmed. I can't just leave. I have work, the house. All taken care of. Claire interrupted. She talked to your boss. You have accumulated vacation time. And I'll check on the house. Sarah thought of everything, Michael. She always did. That night, after Claire left, I found myself pulling out my old camera from the closet. The battery was dead, but I plugged it in to charge, feeling something stir within me for the first time since Sarah's death. Not happiness, not even close, but perhaps a tiny spark of possibility. The Arizona workshop nearly broke me. Being surrounded by strangers, all enthusiastic about capturing beauty while I could barely see past my grief, was excruciating. The first 3 days, I almost booked a flight home multiple times. But each night, I reread Sarah's letters, and each morning, I forced myself to pick up my camera again. On the 4th day, as the sun rose over the desert, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber, I found myself instinctively adjusting my settings, framing a shot of light filtering through a saguaro cactus. For a brief moment, I forgot to actively grieve. When I realized it later, the guilt was overwhelming. The first time you forget to be sad, it feels like a betrayal, said a voice beside me. I turned to find one of the workshop instructors, an older woman named Eleanor with silver hair and sun-weathered skin. I lost my husband 12 years ago. Cancer too. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. It gets easier, she continued, gazing out at the horizon. Not better necessarily, but easier. And the guilt, that fades too, eventually. How did you know? I asked. Eleanor smiled sadly. I recognized the look. We're members of a club nobody wants to join. She patted my shoulder gently. Keep taking pictures, Michael. The world doesn't stop being beautiful just because we're hurting. I took hundreds of photos during those 2 weeks. Most were terrible, technically flawed and emotionally empty. But a few, a handful, captured something real. A desert flower pushing through cracked earth. The silhouette of mountains against a twilight sky. An elderly couple holding hands on a park bench, their faces lined with decades of shared joys and sorrows. When I returned home, the house didn't feel quite as empty. I printed my best photos and hung them alongside the ones Sarah and I had collected over the years. I shaved my beard. I called my brother. I even threw away those flannel pajamas. 6 months after Sarah's death, Claire appeared at my door again, this time with a third letter. Are you sure I'm ready for this one? I asked, only half joking. Claire studied me for a moment. I think you are. Sarah thought you would be. This letter was different from the others. Less instructional, more reflective. Sarah wrote about our life together, about the joy we'd shared, about her hopes for my future. And then, near the end, she wrote something that stopped my heart. There's a support group that meets at the community center on Thursday evenings. People who've lost spouses, trying to figure out how to move forward. I want you to go, Michael. Not to find someone new, though I wouldn't begrudge you that happiness if it comes, but to find yourself again. To remember that grief shared is grief diminished. You're not alone in this journey, my love, even though it feels that way. I didn't go that Thursday. Or the next. But on the 3rd Thursday after receiving the letter, I found myself sitting in my car outside the community center, debating whether to go in. I was about to drive away when I spotted a woman struggling with a box of donuts and coffee carriers, nearly dropping everything. Without thinking, I jumped out to help her, catching a coffee tray just before it hit the ground. "Thank you," she said breathlessly. "I always try to bring refreshments, but I never remember how impossible it is to carry everything." "You're here for the group?" I couldn't bring myself to say. "Widow and Widowers Support Group," out loud. She nodded. 3 years now. First as a participant, now more as a facilitator. "I'm Rebecca." "Michael," I replied. "It's my first time." Rebecca's smile was gentle. "The first time is the hardest. But I promise it helps." I followed her inside, carrying the donuts while she managed the coffee. The room was already half full with people of all ages. Some were talking quietly, others sitting alone. All wore the same invisible badge of grief I'd been carrying. "We don't have to talk about them if you don't want to," Rebecca explained as we set up the refreshments. "Sometimes we just talk about movies or books or the weather. Sometimes we cry. Sometimes we laugh. There are no rules except respect." I stayed at the back that first meeting, listening as others shared stories of loss and survival. A young man whose wife died in childbirth. An elderly woman adjusting to life without her husband of 52 years. A middle-aged man whose partner had been killed in a car accident. Their pain was different from mine, yet somehow the same. When the meeting ended, Rebecca approached me again. "Will you come back next week?" I hesitated. "I think so. My wife, Sarah, she wanted me to come. She arranged it all before she died. Letters, instructions. She didn't want me to be alone." Rebecca's eyes softened. "She sounds like an amazing woman." "She was," I said, and for the first time, the past tense didn't feel like a knife in my chest. I did go back the next week. And the week after that. Gradually, I began to share my own story. How Sarah and I met. How we'd planned to start a family before her diagnosis. How she'd orchestrated my healing from beyond the grave. "That's extraordinary," Rebecca said one evening as we walked to our cars after a meeting. "Most of us are just thrown into grief with no roadmap." "She was always the planner between us," I admitted. I used to tease her about it, but now I'm just grateful. It's like she's still taking care of me somehow." Rebecca smiled. "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" "Not here, I mean. Just coffee." The invitation caught me off guard. It wasn't romantic, at least I didn't think it was, but it was the first social invitation I'd received in nearly a year that wasn't from family or old friends checking up on me. "I'd like that," I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. Coffee with Rebecca became a regular occurrence. We talked about our lost spouses, but also about books and politics and our jobs. She was a high school counselor with a wicked sense of humor that reminded me, in some ways, of Sarah. Not in a way that felt like replacement, but in a way that felt like recognition, the familiarity of a kindred spirit. On the 1-year anniversary of Sarah's death, I visited her grave alone. I brought her favorite sunflowers and a small photo album of pictures I'd taken throughout the year. "I'm trying, Sarah," I whispered, tracing the letters of her name on the headstone. "It's not easy, but I'm trying." That evening, Claire came over with the final letter. We sat together on the porch swing that Sarah had insisted we needed when we bought the house, though we'd rarely used it while she was alive. "This is the last one," Claire said softly. She wrote it just a few days before the end. The envelope felt heavier than the others, though I knew that was just my imagination. I opened it carefully, preserving the seal as I had with all her letters. "My dearest Michael," Sarah wrote, her handwriting shakier than in the previous letters. "If you're reading this, you've made it through a year without me. I'm so proud of you, my love. So proud and so grateful." Tears blurred my vision, but I continued reading. "I don't know what your life looks like now. I don't know if you've found new joy or if you're still searching. But I know you're still here, still moving forward, and that's all I ever wanted. Remember when we talked about what gives life meaning? You said it was creating something that outlasts you. I used to think that meant children for us, But now I think it's simpler than that. We create meaning in the lives we touch, and the love we leave behind. I had to stop reading for a moment, overcome. Claire squeezed my hand silently. This is my last letter to you, Michael. Not because I have nothing more to say. I could fill libraries with all the things I wish I could tell you, but because it's time for you to write your own story now. Whatever that looks like, know that I am cheering you on from wherever I am. Know that loving someone new, if that happens, doesn't diminish what we had. Know that being happy again would be the greatest gift you could give me. I love you eternally, but I release you completely. Live well, my darling. That's all I ask. Forever yours, Sarah. Claire and I sat in silence as the sun set, casting long shadows across the yard Sarah had so lovingly tended. Finally she spoke. She loved you so much, Michael. Enough to let you go. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. In the months that followed, I began to feel like myself again, not the same self I had been with Sarah, but not entirely different either. I joined a local photography club. I reconnected with friends. I started mentoring young architects at my firm. And yes, my friendship with Rebecca deepened into something more, something neither of us had expected but both of us treasured. The first time I kissed Rebecca, standing in the gentle rain after a movie, I felt a curious mixture of joy and sorrow. Later that night, I took out all of Sarah's letters and reread them, seeking permission I already knew she had given. She didn't want you to be alone, I whispered to myself, echoing Claire's words from that terrible day at the funeral. 3 years after Sarah's death, I stood in my bedroom, packing a suitcase. Rebecca and I were taking a trip to the coast, to the same beach town where Sarah and I had honeymooned. It had been Rebecca's idea. We should honor her there, she'd suggested. Bring some of her ashes if you're comfortable with that. She's part of your story, Michael, and I want to acknowledge that. As I packed, I came across a small box I hadn't opened since before Sarah's illness. Inside were mementos from our early relationship, movie ticket stubs, dried flowers, notes we'd written each other. At the bottom was a photograph I'd taken of Sarah on that honeymoon, standing on the beach at sunset, laughing as waves chased her feet. I carefully placed the photo in my wallet, next to a more recent one of Rebecca and me at the Grand Canyon. Two loves, different but both precious. Both part of me. That evening, as Rebecca and I drove toward the coast, I felt a sense of peace that had been elusive for so long. The grief hadn't disappeared. I knew now it never would completely, but it had transformed into something I could carry without being crushed by its weight. What are you thinking about? Rebecca asked, glancing over from the driver's seat. I smiled, watching the landscape roll by. I'm thinking about how love doesn't end. It just changes form. Rebecca reached over and squeezed my hand. Sarah was right, you know. About what? About you being worth waiting for. Worth planning for. She kept her eyes on the road, but I could see the gentle curve of her smile. I'm glad she didn't want you to be alone. As the sun set behind us and the road stretched ahead, I felt gratitude wash over me, for Sarah's foresight and final gift of permission, for Rebecca's. As the sun set behind us and the road stretched ahead, I felt gratitude wash over me, for Sarah's foresight and final gift of permission, for Rebecca's patience and understanding, and for the strange, winding path that grief had carved through my life. The next morning, Rebecca and I walked along the same stretch of beach where Sarah and I had once strolled as newlyweds. I carried a small urn containing a portion of Sarah's ashes. We didn't speak much, but the silence between us was comfortable, respectful. At the farthest point of the beach, where rocky cliffs met the water, I stopped. This had been Sarah's favorite spot, where we'd watched dolphins play one memorable morning of our honeymoon. I think this is the place, I said quietly. Rebecca nodded and stepped back, giving me space. I opened the small urn with trembling hands and watched as the ocean breeze caught Sarah's ashes, carrying them out over the water in a gentle swirl. Thank you, I whispered, words meant only for Sarah. For everything. For loving me enough to let me go. As I stood there, I felt a weight lifting, not the weight of grief, which had already lightened over time, but the weight of guilt I hadn't realized I was still carrying. The guilt of moving forward, of finding happiness again. Rebecca joined me at the water's edge, slipping her hand into mine. We watched the waves for a long time, neither of us needing to fill the moment with words. That night, in our hotel room overlooking the ocean, I showed Rebecca all of Sarah's letters. She read them carefully, with reverence, occasionally wiping away tears. "She loved you so completely," Rebecca said when she finished. "Not many people experience that kind of love even once in a lifetime. I've been fortunate enough to experience it twice," I replied, meeting her eyes. 5 years to the day after Sarah's funeral, I stood in the garden she had planted, now flourishing under Rebecca's care. We'd decided to keep the house, to build our life together in the space that held so many memories. Not to replace them, but to add to them. Claire visited often, bringing her children who called me Uncle Michael and Rebecca Aunt Becca without any confusion or contradiction. Sarah remained present in our lives, in photographs on the walls, in stories we shared, in the traditions we maintained and the new ones we created. That evening, as Rebecca and I sat on the porch swing that now creaked from regular use, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. How the words spoken at a funeral, "She didn't want you to be alone," had somehow become not just a comfort but a permission, a blessing, and ultimately, a prophecy fulfilled. "What are you thinking about?" Rebecca asked, echoing her question from that drive to the beach years earlier. I smiled, watching the sunset paint the garden in golden light. "I'm thinking that grief is really just love with nowhere to go. And how fortunate I am that mine found somewhere to land." Rebecca leaned her head against my shoulder. "Sarah would be proud of you. Of us." "Yes," I said softly. "I believe she would. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, I like to think that Sarah was smiling, satisfied that her final gift to me had been received exactly as she'd intended, not as an ending, but as permission to begin again."